Welcome to the first edition of Classic Drummer Interviews. It's a new segment on my channel, and I'm going to cover classic drummer interviews from Modern Drummer magazine, but I decided not to make it Modern Drummer only because I have a lot of magazines that I've read over the years, from Drum Magazine, Rhythm Magazine, and others that I may pull into this segment and talk about a drummer. The first one's going to come from the first year I read Modern Drummer magazine, and the first year I read Modern Drummer magazine was actually the second year of Modern Drummer. Now, this is a compilation magazine of 4 issues that made up the second year of Modern Drummer magazine. I did not get hip to Modern Drummer until, I guess it was January of 1978. January 1978. It's hard for me to even remember that time, but January 1978, I was looking at the end of the, I guess it was the end of the second marking period for high school, or the beginning of the third marking period for high school, my senior year of high school. I was a senior in high school, and I was taking drum lessons at Blue Note Music in Long Branch, New Jersey, and I was studying with my good friend and teacher, Scott Hazen. And on the rack, I think it was on a rack somewhere, or on a table there in Blue Note downstairs, I remember seeing the first issue of Modern Drummer, which was Tony Williams on the cover. And I'll eventually get to that issue. But by the summer of 78, I had graduated high school, and I was working at the now infamous water park and water slide they had in Long Branch, New Jersey. And I was running the parking lot at the time, before I got transferred to the water slide itself. And I was reading Carmen Appice, that Carmen Appice issue, which I'll talk about someday. And I was reading the Ed Shaughessy issue. And that's the one that came out about July of that year, because Modern Drummer was a quarterly magazine when it first came out. The first year of Modern Drummer was in January of 1977. That would have been my junior year of high school. And the first person on Modern Drummer magazine the first year was Buddy Rich. Okay, so now we're in the second year, and it started with Tony Williams. The second year cover number 2 was Carmen Appice. Cover number 3 was Ed Shaughessy and the LA Scene. And the last one of the year in 78, by the time I was in college, was Steve Gadd. Okay, so let's start with this issue. Let me just show you that I have the issue, and boy, is this in great shape. No, it's actually not in very good shape. The cover's been ripped off. It's been well worn. It's been through spills and all kinds of crazy stuff. One thing about my magazine collection is I use my magazine collection. But this issue of Modern Drummer magazine was a pivotal issue for me, because it was the introduction of me to studio drummers. It was really the first time in my entire career as a drummer. I was in a band my senior year of high school, not college, senior year of high school. I got into a band in the fall of that year, and we were starting to do dances, school dances, and that kind of stuff. And I was starting to hear lots of different music. Prior to being in that band, my only influence for playing drums was Buddy Rich and Danny Serafin of Chicago. Hal Blaine was an influence, and I read his name on the back of records that we had in our house, like the Carpenters or the Partridge Family, because that's what we had. My mom was not a big avid record collector. My sister was just starting to collect records, okay? But for me, I found Chicago, and Danny Serafin was the name I remember the most. And I remember playing the Chicago records. So when I read this issue of Modern Drummer magazine, it was the first time I started to be really introduced to studio drummers. It was actually this year, 78 was when I was introduced to it, because the first issue with Tony Williams had Larry London, the famous Nashville studio drummer, on it. And the second issue with Carmen Appice had Mel Lewis, the famous big band jazz drummer, who was a New York City studio musician. So in this issue, I got to see the Tonight Show drummer, Ed Shaughessy, who was on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson for a long time, right till the end. He was an LA studio drummer, and other LA studio drummers like John Guerin or Russ Kunkel or Joe and Jeff Porcaro. Yes, they put Joe, his dad, with Jeff on this first issue. And it was my first introduction to Jeff Porcaro pre-Toto, because in this article he actually talks about forming a band called Toto. And it was before the first album came out. And he'd already played with Sonny and Cher. He'd played on Steely Dan albums. He had played with Seals and Croft, and he was an LA guy. He was starting to get phone calls and playing on sessions on all kinds of records coming out of LA. So this was a huge pivotal issue for me, and it's one that I reviewed this month when I was on a business trip. I actually went in here, and this is a cleaner copy, so I'm going to go through some of this magazine with you. And just to give you a picture of it, the front cover had a picture of Mick Fleetwood on it. He was endorsing Ludwig drums at the time, and Ludwig rocker heads were being pushed. One of the things I saw being pushed in MD this year was electronic drums. The first time I ever heard of electronic drums was the Syndrum by Joe Pollard. He made the Syndrum unit, and everybody that was interviewed in this issue, except for Ed Shaughessy, talked about Syndrums. I mean, Jeff Porcaro talked about Syndrums. Russ Kunkel talked about Syndrums a little bit. John Guerin had a picture of Syndrums. I'll show you a picture of John Guerin. This is Eddie Shaughessy. But John Guerin's picture right here, he's got a set of Syndrums right there, 4 of them. So they were the hot new item to come out. Also in this issue was the first time I heard of a drum shop. And this was, the drum shop was Bob Yeager's professional drum shop, Hollywood, USA. And I would come to love drum shops. This is the first one I ever read about, was the one in Hollywood, which is one of the drum shops in the country that I'd never been to and always wanted to go to. My friend Mike Frazano hangs out at this shop all the time. Pro Drum Shop in Hollywood. Probably has some of the same stuff hanging around the walls of it. But this issue, I was introduced to Jeff Porcaro. At the time of the writing of this, he had no endorsements. He was playing a lot of Ludwig drums. He had a lot of different drum kits. I'll just to give you a picture of some of the things he said in this issue that really kind of struck me. He was talking about his drum kits. He said, I have 3 Ludwig drum sets. 2 of them consist of a 22-inch bass drum, 9 by 13, 10 by 14, 16 by 16, 18 by 18 toms. Now, I'm not so sure you got the sizes right. One of the things about the early writing in Modern Drummer, especially the first couple years I was reading it, was the interviewers didn't always get everything right. They didn't spell names right and all kinds of stuff. Matter of fact, Rick Marotta's name wasn't spelled right in this issue at one point when he talked about Rick Marotta. But he was also he had 2 Gretsch sets at the time, 8 by 12, 9 by 13, 16 by 16, and the other was an 18-inch bass drum with a 7 by 10, 8 by 12, 14 by 14. Then he talked about a Camco set. He had lots of drums, okay? But as he points out, he had only 1 set of cymbals at the time. He didn't even say if it was Zildjian or Paiste. It was just a 22-inch ride, and then he had a few crash cymbals that he stole from his dad. It was just a really interesting point to make in this particular issue. Also, this was my first introduction to Russ Kunkel, who I didn't know played on all these different, with all these different artists that I like to listen to, like Jackson Browne. Okay, in 1978, Jackson Browne had a big hit with a song called Running on Empty, and Russ Kunkel played drums on that. Matter of fact, his kit was on the back cover of that album, the Running on Empty album. So, big, huge thing. And I learned about the rhythm section, The Section, with Lee Sklar. And him and Lee Sklar working with James Taylor and all kinds of people. Another person I saw for the first time, didn't know anything about, was a guy named Harvey Mason, who was playing Rogers drums at the time. Yes, Rogers drums were around. And Harvey was a Rogers player. The magazine was really cool at the time. It had a lot of transcription type stuff and reading to do. And one of the transcriptions it had in this particular issue was the famous solo from Asia. And it's the outro of Asia album. And it was written out by a guy named Chuck Kerrigan, and he actually transcribed the Steely Dan Asia outro, which I remember a couple friends of mine in college actually working on to kind of learn some of those triplets that were written out here. You know, those Gadd triplets, which were actually Bonham triplets too. It's amazing. Made some amazing stuff in here. Anyhow, I find it fascinating, some of these old issues, and just some of the equipment you're seeing too. I mean, Syndrums were being pushed, big large drum kits were being pushed at the time. The endorsers, you know, some of the guys that you would see with other drum companies were coming along. Alex Acuna was playing Rogers drums at the time. He was playing with Weather Report when this was, I think this issue came out. A lot of cool stuff. So, my first experience with Modern Drummer magazine came in 1978. And Modern Drummer put out a couple of these first and second years. And I was at a Modern Drum Festival in the 90s. I think it was probably the 97 or 98 drum festival I went to with my friend Pat O'Donnell and some other buds. And in the goodie package was a copy of the second year, and I also got a copy of the first year. So I never had any of the first year magazines, but I got that version of it, the compilation version, and then I had the first year, and I was able to read the first year. So I, in theory, have read all the magazines of Modern Drummer from the first year right on up through today. I'm still a subscriber to Modern Drummer magazine. And a lot of guys ask me where I get my drum knowledge from. It's from Modern Drummer magazine. All 40-something years of reading Modern Drummer. So, anyhow, this is the first segment. Now, what I'd like to do in this segment is not make it Ask Earl anything, but if you have a question about a drummer or an issue of Modern Drummer that you'd like to hear about, you know, that's your favorite, and I have it, I've read it, I'll definitely comment about those things. I may comment in Ask Earl, I may comment here. But I just want you to know there's some great material. That was our first introduction to Jeff Porcaro. Jeff Porcaro would end up being on the cover of Modern Drummer magazine 3 times. One would be in '82. I have that issue. And when he was with Toto, when Toto 4 and Rosanna came out. It was the first time you saw him with Pearl drums after Rosanna came out. The next one would be he's playing Pearl drums, actually sitting there not in a Pearl drum kit on the cover. He's got a talking drum and some other kind of percussion there, but he's got Pearl drums inside it. That's the second interview issue in the '88 issue. He had the red Pearl kit. And the next time you would see Jeff Porcaro on the cover was at his death in '92. I believe it was '92. May it came out in '93. But he died in August of '92. I think by the end of the year they had worked him in. And that's another sad but classic issue of Modern Drummer magazine. So Jeff spent some time in Modern Drummer magazine, and as you know, Jeff Porcaro is one of my all-time favorite drummers. So I think it was interesting that I got introduced to him in such a way as first hearing about him in Modern Drummer, and then I started going back filling the record collection to kind of hear him. I actually found a copy of Katie Lied in my library. So at some point I bought the album version of Katie Lied, and then it must have been right before I bought the CD version of Katie Lied. And Steely Dan's Katie Lied is all Jeff Porcaro except for one track. The 9th track was Hal Blaine played on. I can't remember the name of the tune, but Jeff played on the whole rest of the album. It was like one of those albums they just let Jeff play on completely. And Katie Lied is a classic Steely Dan album. So, really cool stuff. By the way, the Ed Shaughessy piece, excellent. You know, hearing Ed Shaughessy talking about his jazz background and then getting on the Tonight Show and all the people he had to play with. I mean, Eddie Shaughessy is another guy that really had an influence on every drummer that grew up in my era because we watched the Tonight Show. And the Tonight Show is where you would see Buddy Rich or Louis Bellson once in a while or Eddie Shaughessy, you know. And I remember loving to watch the late night shows to see the drummers on the late night shows. So The Tonight Show has had some great drummers over the years. And then as the show's kind of broadened out, by the late 80s when Johnny Carson was getting close to retiring, he retired in 92. That was Ed Shaughessy's last issue that he was on the cover, that I remember. It was August of 82 or somewhere around there. That's when the Tonight Show left. There were some other shows popped up. And one of them was the Joan Rivers Show, of course. And the drummer for the Joan Rivers Show was Vinnie Colaiuta. He was the first drummer for the Joan Rivers Show. And there's actually a cool clip of Vinnie playing on the Rivers Show. I used to just watch the Joan Rivers Show just for the intro of the show, thinking about those late night shows. When Vinnie came on and was playing with Joan Rivers, I would watch just the first 5 minutes of it. Once the monologue started, I would maybe flip back over to Carson. But it was exciting to watch that band play on the Joan Rivers Show with Vinnie playing drums, because you didn't know what he was going to do every single night of the week. He always had this one section of the tune where he did these crazy outside fills, and you never knew what he was going to do at any time. So that particular collage of Vinnie playing the opening song, they got him in all different kinds of outfits, and his kit never really changed too much. I will tell you that in that video, there's a clip of Vinnie playing Paiste cymbals. He was trying some Paiste 2002s out. And it comes near the very end of the video, you see him playing some Paistes, which was kind of interesting. But that intro to the show was just an amazing song. And Vinnie would just play some really outside stuff, and it was cool. So I remember the Tonight Show because, again, Tonight Show with Ed Shaughessy. Ed Shaughessy was always playing. I remember the famous drum battle with Buddy Rich. I remember Buddy Rich being on there a bazillion times. Sometimes when I go watch Buddy Rich stuff on YouTube, it's watching Tonight Show clips. And I've seen Buddy play behind Eddie Shaughessy's kits at different times. I just saw a clip the other day he was doing, which was Buddy, playing Ed Shaughessy's Pearl kit. And Eddie used to have some really unique kits too. He had a Pearl kit with two bass drums, one with a 24 and one with I think it was a 20. And he had an 8x12, two 9x13s, and a 10x14. Eventually that would switch out to, I think it was a 9x13 and a 9x13, 16, 18, 14x14 floor tom on this side with a 6, 8, 10 concert tom and the two odd-sized bass drums. And then eventually he'd go to Ludwig, and Ludwig he'd end up having, he had a really unique Ludwig kit, Eddie Shaughessy, back in the day, where he had a 12x10 and a 9x13 up top, the 16x16, 16x18, and then he had the double-headed concert tom 6, 8, 10 power toms. So Ed Shaughessy's always had cool kits, on the Tonight Show. And it was worth watching the Tonight Show, too, to see Eddie Shaughessy play with all those different acts. But that was a great issue. Russ Kunkel. I got introduced to John Guerin. John Guerin, LA Express. Tom Scott and the LA Express. John Guerin played on a bazillion tunes in LA. He was an awesome drummer. He died way too young, too. He died in like his 60s, I believe. He was a young guy. Great, awesome studio drummer, And I met all these guys in Modern Drummer. That's where I heard about them. Then I would go back and find their records with them playing on things. I mean, John Guerin, in this article, I learned he played on Joni Mitchell's Court and Spark album, Free Man to Paris, Free Man to Paris. It's got a great groove to it. It's one of those things I listen to in my playlist on my Spotify that my wife and I love. It's just one of those songs that pops up and it's John Guerin playing drums. I mean, amazing stuff. So, anyhow, I hope you like this segment. Please please subscribe. I'm still doing Ask Earl Anything. I'm still doing Drum Talk, but the new segment is going to be called Classic Drummer Interviews. And this one was kind of like a classic Modern Drummer issue one. I'll dig down into some of the interviews next time. Coming down the pike are some Steve Gadd stuff. I may do a whole one on Jeff Porcaro, just Jeff Porcaro at some point. But I have a lot of issues of Modern Drummer magazine to look at and to bring into the fold. So thanks for watching, and have a great day.